And then we also wanted to demonstrate a watershed-friendly prescription called group selection, where we would harvest small little openings about 1/3 hectare in size, or technically, we laid out the little openings to be about 2 tree heights in size. And those openings are so small that you hardly notice them. They're clear cut, but they're so small they fit into the landscape really well visually. But they also catch a lot of snow, but because they're so small, they're shaded in the spring, and the snow runs off and melts later, like the snow behind on the north side of your house. It melts later, and so it desynchronizes the runoff, and it's an old European watershed-friendly prescription. And so those 3 types of prescriptions we initially demonstrated over hundreds of hectares on Goat Mountain. And there was a lot of skepticism the first couple of years until we started bringing people up onto Goat Mountain and showing them what we were doing. And even the most critical people were really surprised at the kind of forest that was left. So we were protecting the watersheds, we were protecting the visuals, we were improving wildlife habitat for deer and elk. And then eventually, this particular forest that we're in right now, we've logged it twice in the last 10 years. We initially thinned it, taking, like I said, 1/3 of the volume, and then after the firestorm of 2003, we hired a fire ecologist named Bob Gray from Chilliwack, and he advised us to thin out the forest even more. And we did, so that the forest had an open canopy. Rather than the trees still being closed, their canopy still being closed like this, they were more open. And you can see that the canopy is open, and so a heat of a ground fire would dissipate up through the canopy and wouldn't climb the ladder fuels and become a crown fire like we saw happen over in Kelowna, and even this summer in multiple places like Kelowna and Lillooet again. And so we've tried to fireproof the mountain. So that's another value that's extremely important nowadays, particularly with global warming and our forests facing a drought. That's something that we hadn't counted on when we started out, but it's a benefit to the community that's quite important. And so we've consistently used those partial cutting systems throughout our operations for the past 10 years. We've been able to harvest now for probably the last 6 or 7 years in Arrow Creek, in the watershed, and still have community support. We believe that our harvesting is not negatively impacting the water. In fact, we've discovered that real watershed protection is not preservation of the forest, but is wise management of the forest. And we're looking to create a forest that has a watershed that has a forest that always has high forest cover, but has multiple species and multiple age classes on almost every hectare. And by doing that, we're creating a forest that is resilient to insect and disease attack. We hope to access the watershed so that if we have a fire, we have a chance of putting that fire out while it's still small. And so we think the best watershed protection is wise management by doing gentle, well-designed, well-constructed access, by creating a forest condition that produces high-quality water, by always having high forest cover, and minimizing the threat of a catastrophic disturbance, either from insects, disease, or fire. And so that's where we're at today, and we're still working at that.
Jim, when the water starts to run in the springtime and the snow melts. What I like about what you're doing here from a watershed standpoint, I see there's all sorts of ground cover. The soil doesn't seem to be noticeably disturbed the way I see it on these massive clear cuts after they're logged, and I notice the water runs off so fast and it's carrying an awful lot of dirt and rock and stuff into the streams and into the lakes. That's not good from a community standpoint, and all the water pollution. And so this looks great to me from a standpoint of holding back the runoff in the spring so that it's slower and you get more constant seasonal runoff instead of it so fast. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Well, a couple of things, Sean. One, this forest has been logged twice in the last 10 years, and we left about 50% of the forest here, and so some of the snow is intercepted by the trees, and it sublimates. It turns from the solid to a gas, and it doesn't hit the ground as water. But when the snow does melt, the snow that's on the ground does melt, it melts slower because it's shaded. It's quite shady here. Even though we're on a southwest aspect on about a 30% slope, the snow melts a lot slower because it's shaded, and that just makes sense.
Cool.
And so that's a big factor. But the other factor is the two times we logged this forest, machine logged it. We logged it with feller buncher and grapple skidders, machine logging, you know. We didn't log it with horses or anything. But we've left some debris on the ground here, and we've left the grasses in place. Both times it was logged in the summertime with dry soil conditions. We did have some disturbance, but we grass seeded the skid trails, and there's a skid trail. In fact, we're on a skid trail here. But some of the debris is left on the site, and that debris slows the runoff. And of course, we've got a lot of needles and duff that are left here from the harvesting because we only took off about half the volume. And so we didn't make a big impact on the soils. But I think a big factor is that we logged it in a dry soil condition. We grass seeded right away. We looked after the skid trails by water barring them. The debris is also important for the long-term soil productivity. It not only helps hold the water, but it also begins to rot and become part of the soil. And so even though some of it may aesthetically look a bit ugly, it's very important to maintain that coarse woody debris because it slows the water runoff. It also, as it begins to rot, it acts as a sponge and holds a lot more water than the soil would. Right. And so there's all those factors. Sure. You know, taking only about half the volume, leaving half the volume to catch some of the snow and create some shade, looking after our skid trails when we're done logging by water barring and grass seeding, maintaining coarse woody debris to help retard the runoff, and give us a long-term supply of nutrients.